Hi, welcome to our channel of IGNOU audiobooks, Indira Gandhi National Open University, School of Humanities, Diploma Postgraduate Diploma Programs. Diploma in Creative Writing in English, DCE. DCE 0 to Feature Writing. Block-1 Writing about Women. Unit-1 Identifying Significant Topics. 1.0 Aims and Objectives. The unit aims at acquainting you with the nature and quality of feature writing on women in newspapers and journals. Much of the writing on women reflects the age-old prejudices and preconceived notions about them. This unit underlines the need for writers to change their basic attitudes to women and to treat them on an equal footing with men. Only then view their feature articles on women's concerns be considered as serious journalism. By the end of this unit, you shall be able to explain why indifferent and irresponsible attitudes to women need to be discarded. Defend the position that women should be approached with humility and imagination if one wants to treat them as equals. Visualize women's problem from many points of view in order to counteract the traditional bias in writing on women. Research well on such topics. Avoid all unsupported accounts and statements, gossip, speculation, cheap sensationalism, etc. Use appropriate language and style _ie. Avoid gender bias in language, suffering and violence not be treated lightly or satirically, and write in a lively and readable style. 1.1 Introduction. Until about 10 or 15 years ago, it was quite difficult to find material on women in Indian newspapers and magazines. Today, things are somewhat different. A number of newspapers carry regular features and news items on women, more and more women's magazines are being published. To my mind, there are a few distinct kinds of writing on women that we find today. There are people who write on women because the subject is now a fashionable one, and as soon as such subject presents itself, they will switch to writing on that. There are others who write simply to ridicule or belittle women, and then there are those who choose to write on women because they believe it is important to do so, in order to set right the neglect women have suffered at FHE hands of the media, as well as to project something that is closer to the reality of women's lives. In this opening unit on Common, we will assess critically the first two kinds and see how the third kind of writing may be cultivated and promoted. 1.2 How women IFGV been treated in Rijang so far. Before proceeding to look at these different kinds of writing, let us examine how journalistic and feature writers, in their writings, have treated the subject of women so far. This is important for us to know before we can discuss the future trends in writing on women. In most feature articles on women, we read about pretty women, always well-dressed, who seem to have all the time in the world on their hands and who miraculously never sweat. Or, there are other common types: good mothers, good wives, good daughters. And if women are not either of these, then very often they are just not there at all. A recent report on women's work by the Food and Agricultural Organization FAO points out, of all the hours worked throughout the world, women contribute to 3 RDAs. Women in rural areas grow at least 50% of the world's food. They work in all aspects of cultivation, including planting, thinning, weeding, applying fertilizer and harvesting. In some regions they also market what they grow. Many of them provide the main or only support for the family. This statement is based on serious research done by the FAO. It establishes quite clearly that women work extremely hard and are central to the society and to life. Yet, when we look for women in the media, do we ever see this kind of portrayal? 1.2.1 Women treated as non-persons. The following example illustrates DFE point I am trying to make. Some years ago, a national daily newspaper began a unique experiment in journalism by adopting a village and carrying regular reports in the development work that was going on there. These reports, however, said little or nothing about women, although they did mention men, sheep, cattle, chickens, hens, pigs, etc. A woman journalist became curious about this and decided to visit the village to see if there actually were any women there. Not surprisingly, she found women at work all over, fetching water, carrying fuel and fodder, working in the fields. She wondered how the male journalists, who wrote those reports, had missed these women. When she questioned them on this, and asked why women were so conspicuous by their absence from the report, some of the men pointed out that they could not write about them because they were not able to talk to them. How then, asked the woman journalist, had they found it possible to write about the cows and pigs? Were they able to talk to them? To this, of course, the men had no answer. So high, although there were plenty of women around, and they were quite clearly making an equal, if not greater, contribution to the village, they had remained invisible somehow. Why? We shall try to answer this as we go on. 1.2 Patronizing attitude. Would the above statement have been any different if the writers had been women? It is difficult to say, for women too might have the same view of reality or approach the situation with the same prejudices as do the male journalists. What the example just given demonstrates is that writing about women, or about any subject, is not an easy job. It can be very tricky, particularly when the subject you are writing about has been neglected for a long time, and furthermore, when its very presence calls up in you certain preconceived notions. What is it that springs to mind when you think of writing for and about women? In 9 cases out of 10, people will think that the only suitable subjects for such writing are fashion, clothes, beauty care, cookery, and babies. Why don't we see women as contributing to every aspect of life? After all, they play a role in such activities as farming, healthcare, politics, etc. Thus, the question to ask yourself is, while writing about women, should one continue the tradition of thinking about them as mere playthings, sex objects, unintelligent human kings with a limited range of interests? Or should one begin to look at them differently, as being central to our life today, as central as men or children? The first thing to bring to bear on such writing, then, is not to let oneself be influenced by existing prejudices and preconceived notions, but to come to it with a new vision and a positive approach. The 1980s is a particularly exciting time to do something like this. Newspapers, magazines, and other media are now beginning to accept writing on women. This is the moment to change such writing and make it new, vibrant, meaningful, and not the same old played out thing it has been so far. 1.3 How to change existing attitudes. The question then arises, how are you going to be able to look at women in a positive and constructive way? How does one bring about change in the way one treats a subject? And how does one begin to consider treating a subject afresh? One of the prerequisites of good writing, to my mind, is that one should approach the subject with humility. Writing about something or someone is a two-way relationship. You give as much to your subject as you take from it. Or, look at it this way, If it was not for the subject, you would have nothing to write about. Many writers approach their subjects with a kind of arrogance. You interview someone and you think you are doing him or her a favor. But, in F. Let, you are not, for you have as much to learn from others as they have from you. I always feel that, in order to write sensitively, one has to cherish people as people, not treat them as mere subjects. Also, one has to be open and willing to look at a problem in all its complexity. This kind of sensitivity can only come if you live by the values you are trying to project in your writing. For example, you cannot be a sensitive writer on women if, in your own life, you treat them with disrespect and treat them as non-entities. 1.3.1 Treat women with respect. This brings us to the next important consideration in such writing, the need to treat your subject with respect. A writer must offer perspectives and have a viewpoint. But he is still not the final authority on the subject. The greater his sense of equality, the more open and understanding he will be. For instance, writers who are politically aware are often impatient with people who lack political consciousness. Unfortunately, women TBO sometimes fall into this category. Suppose, for example, YW are a feminist and you decide to interview a 65-year-old woman who has been active in the freedom struggle, but who feels quite impatient with feminism as we know it today. You can either listen to her with respect and try to find out the reasons for her feeling the way she does, or you can be impatient with her for feeling differently from you. It takes little to imagine what any sensible journalist would do in such a situation. 1.3 To be responsible, not just clever. The following example illustrates another important aspect of writing on women, the need for the writer to be responsible. I quote from an article entitled Struggling for Space by Sujata Madhok, a well-known woman journalist. I quote her words here. The cartoon shows a mother-in-law pouring a can of kerosene on a hapless bride. It is not kerosene, my dear, it is your flight of fancy, mine-law says, while hubby follows with matches. Murder, one always thought, was not a subject for humor. But this educative cartoon illustrates a serious article in a news tabloid on IO Delhi High Court judgment in the Sudha Goyal burning case, Blitz, 3rd December 1983. The serious intent of the article is further vitiated by frivolous subheadings. For instance, a paragraph which concludes that more women will continue to get burnt until they find economic and emotional independence to walk out of destructive marriages is given the outrageous subhead bum, baby, bum till independence comes. 1.3.3 Avoid frivolity. Another article speaks of the rape of a minor girl by two policemen. To policemen in rather frivolous terms, the Mathura case was, as rapes go, somewhat pedestrian goes on to describe it as an ambiguous investigation of an alleged assault by two pajama-clad policemen of a somewhat precocious and sexually forward girl. Note how the fact of policemen wearing pajamas is casually brought in to trivialize the rape, and Mathura's alleged forwardness is put forth as an excuse for laying her open to such assault. When people begin to write, they tend to forget that they are raking up quite a heavy responsibility, that they are more or less casting themselves in the role of truth givers. Rape is no subject for fun. Often when you question people about where they got certain facts or opinions from, they say, but I read it in the papers, or I saw it on television. Thus, whatever appears in the media is seen as A. objective and B. fact. Clearly, the Media exercises tremendous authority. It is seen as reflecting the truth and existing values. But what we TBND to forget is that, because of its seeming authority, the media plays an equal role in shaping public opinion. So, if newspaper articles, for example, portray women as mere objects and not as human beings, people begin to believe that this is actually so. And if you are taking upon yourself the role of a writer, you are equally taking upon yourself the responsibility to write truthfully, honestly, objectively, and critically with a sense of judgment. The kind of cleverness and smartness we have seen in the examples given above is too easy to fail into, but few people are fooled into thinking that such writing is good. 1.4 Some suggestions about writing on women. At this point, you may well ask why any of these criteria should be considered special to writing on women. Should not they apply to all writing? The answer to that, of course, is yes. For the reality is that only too often, while writing on women, they are forgotten, because most of such writing today is patently irresponsible and indifferent. I think it is important to keep this in mind and therefore stress the importance of the points we have here discussed. I have been talking about how attitudes and prejudices get transferred into one's writing, particularly on highly charged themes such as women. I have also highlighted the need for a change. This is not as easy as it seems. Ideas about women are at the very basis of any conservative society, and change is seen as threat. It will inevitably be resisted. Therefore, to write about women against the social bias will be an act of courage. Here are some guidelines which can shape your writing to make it convincing and acceptable. 1.4.1 Need to research well. Research is an important requirement of writing on women. It is necessary to make sure of your facts and your points before you put them down on paper, because once they are in print, they tend to become gospel. Thus, for example, in recent years there has been a great deal of writing on bride burning in newspapers and magazines all over the country. Many of these reports have quoted statistics on how many brides are burnt to death in one city in 1 year. Often, the figures vary from 300 to 600 in Delhi alone. Clearly, this is an enormous variation. Yet no one has really asked where these statistics come from in the first place. Irresponsibility. Again, is it not? The implications of such lapses go much deeper than we may imagine. For instance, one of the reasons why many developmental policies are so male-oriented is that when development agencies begin to collect statistics, they often find that their researchers have been irresponsible and have simply taken the material from existing sources, or they have omitted to include women altogether because they are not used to seeing them or seeing their work. And so women continue to be treated as inferior. A woman who makes her mark in any area of public life is considered unique more than a woman. Her achievements, therefore, are not an incentive to the improvement of women's conditions. Whatever is being done to place women in their proper perspective is haphazard. Research and statistics are, therefore, vital for accurate treatment of women's problems. 1.4.2 A lively and simple style. As far as possible, writing on women should be in a lively, easy and readable style. This is because any writing is always more popular if it is easy, and writing on women is usually heavy and dull. People, especially those who feel such writing is taking up too much place in the media, often feel hostile to articles and features on Women. If the style is heavy, it gives them something more to complain about. So for these people, as well as for your general reader, it is important that you make your writing readable and simple. Anis Jung's feature article Women Will Sit on Chairs. The Times of India, Sunday Review, 12th July 1987, which discusses the problem of illiterate women being at the mercy of their husbands, is eminently readable because it is genuine and positive. Is she guilty, this small, shriveled, desolate woman? Tired at 50, she bore her husband 5 girls and after his death lived a tenuous life with just one mission: to see her daughters settled. To settle a girl in these parts as elsewhere means finding for her a house she can call her own and a man who will play protector, even if he is not quite her own but is shared. To possess a man then seems as important here as possessing a room of one's own. They are factors that are interchangeable. The protector is a man who by merely owning her weaves a chadar of ijjat around her, her only security blanket in society. By taking her as a wife, even if she is one of squirrel, he puts a price on her nameless head. Ownership, however dubious or diffused, lends a woman respectability. She belongs. Mernuna Bibi, better known as Manubain in her new incarnation, does not belong. For she chose to live without a protector. Elder of the 2 daughters, married and abandoned by the husband of her own sister, she doggedly pursued a career. She became a village health worker, fought to have her only daughter admitted in Cairn English medium school, continued to work on her farm near the river and walked through the village with her medical kit even whilst the men stared and the women gossiped. They did not admire her. Quite often newspaper reports of assault cases would leave you cold, and if they happened to be long-winded, you would never read them to the end. 1.4. 3. The place for humor. Humor enlivens even the most serious themes and adds to readability. There is a great deal to be said for humor. But the kind of humor we have seen in the examples given above in 1.3.2 and 1.3.3 assumes that the writer is a superior being who looks down from some height upon his subject. It is not sympathetic humor. There are different ways of laughing at and with people, and you need not necessarily humiliate them when you do so. For example, the illustration in 1.2.1 of male attitudes to writing on women has been handled genially, and the humor is not offensive. She wondered. To this, of course, the man had no answer. Whereas the attempt at humor in the newspaper report quoted in 1.3.3 is coarse. 1.4.4 Language. Avoid gender bias. Language is particularly important in any feature writing on women. Apart from the fact that the language you use should be simple, you should consciously avoid the gender bias inherent in our use of language. Just as in our earlier example, we saw how women had been left out of the article on village development by their absence. So also, language often shuts out women from even the most ordinary discussion, as though they do not exist at 811. Here, the fault lies equally in the language as in our use of it. Why is it, for example, that we always speak of man and men when we mean both men and women? If a newspaper is advertising a particular event, it can do so in two quite different ways. It will tell you that there is an exhibition of paintings by women painters, but it will never say there is an exhibition of paintings by men painters. This would seem to imply that painters are men and women painters are mere curiosities. Similarly, people use the masculine noun and pronoun man or he to represent both men and women. But this can often cause problems, as may be seen from the example below. This book can be read by people who wonder about strange facts: why men speak and why animals don't, why man feels so sad in the 20th century. If we were to take this passage at its face value, we would conclude that men speak. But women obviously don't, since the writer hasn't mentioned them. The lapse is even more noticeable because, just before saying this, the writer has referred to women and men as people. It would have cost him nothing to continue in the same vein and to have written why people speak and why animals don't. Language is not rigid or unchanging. All over the world, it has kept pace with new developments in science, technology, medicine, human relationships, and new words are constantly being coined to accommodate these changes. For example, 300 years ago, we did not have a word for the telephone. Today we do. Similarly, not so long ago, African people, because they were enslaved by the Americans, were known insultingly as wogs, sanbos, Negroes. Today, few people would use these words as they quite clearly reflect an inbuilt prejudice on the part of the speaker. For women too, just as for black people who were originally known as Negroes, the reality is changing. They are now fighting harder than ever before to claim their rightful share of a life and a world that they have created equally with men. Removing the prejudice against them that is inherent in the use of language as we know it is a key responsibility for the new writer. This may sound difficult, but in actual practice it is not so. What it implies is that one should be aware that language will be discriminatory, and one should look out for ways to remove this bias. Let us look at a few examples. If a man can drive 500 miles in 10 hours, he will be able to reach from destination A to destination B. Can easily be changed to read: if you can drive 500 miles in 10 hours, you will be able to reach FRBM. Destination A to destination B. Or, when ancient man developed agriculture. Can read: when our ancestors developed agriculture. Or, men have always hoped to conquer disease. Can read: human societies have always hoped to conquer disease. The argument often posed to counter these kinds of changes is that the word man, or the pronoun he, includes both men and women. But that it does not, and cannot do so, is clear from the following examples. Men have many functions to perform in life, including bearing and breeding children. Surely, here the term men cannot include both men and women, as men do not bear children. Thus, as you can see, you need to be careful about how you use language. Gender bias in language is visible everywhere in the use of men to include women as if they had no identity of their own, in the use of masculine pronouns, prefixes, manpower, or suffixes, brakemen, etc. The careful writer will have to make sure that such bias is kept out of his writings, otherwise he will simply be reinforcing stereotypes. 1.5 Summing up. Given below are the main points discussed in this unit. The discriminatory attitude against women is due to prejudices and preconceived ideas about them. An attitude of indifference, irresponsibility, and frivolity marks bad writing on women. A humble and imaginative approach needs to be cultivated in order to view the role of women in a proper perspective. The contribution of women in nation-building activities has to be recognized. The principle of equality of status for women has to be accepted, and gender bias in writing should be shed. Facts concerning the condition of women need to be researched and established. to help us change our traditional attitudes. Thank you. Subscribe to our channel for more updates, and we will see you with the next chapter.